but also convergences in your two projects in the cases that you're representing. And I'm hoping that this conversation can be a way to understand the differences in positions between maybe these two organizations and the types of political projects that are being represented and being fought for. So I mean, something really kind of struck me with in something in Hilde's presentation, where you said this phrase to protect. You want them to protect their pipelines, their own pipelines. And I've come across in research on questions of oil that ecological or questions relating to, let's say, good practice or sustainability, like conservation or protecting, actually become applied to very counterintuitive subject matters. For example, this idea of protecting the pipelines instead of protecting the livelihoods of the people that the pipeline run into. Similarly, with oil, sometimes there's this discourse around the conservation of resources. But the conservation of resources is not to leave the oil in the ground. It's actually to make sure you don't take too much out so it depletes the entire thing. So there's this kind of weird inversion of kind of who is, let's say, what type of claim is being articulated, and let's say who is really the subject at fault, and what is the crime that is being claimed of, or that is being claimed to have happened. And so I think in Milieudefensie's case, it's quite clear, explicitly what the issue, or let's say what the stakes are, or what the specific points of contestation are. But I wonder if for Samaneh, because your case, now maybe it's because it hasn't reached a court of law, or maybe it's because there's a very different scale, there's a different scope. It seems to me, at least, to be a little bit more open-ended. I mean, at the end of your presentation, when you were showing and speaking about the human likeness of the humaneness of an orangutan, it made me think. So, could we actually see this as murder? But I wonder if you can maybe speak about in this case of ecocide, more specifically, what the specific claims are that you might be advocating for, or what the demands are that you might make on these plantation owners or the companies that own them.
Should I start? Yeah.
It was a long-winded question.
What was the question again? No, I'm teasing you. Sorry.
So yes, it's kind of like to some extent it's something that we're trying to play with, that we're trying to kind of like, it's still a question of what exactly we would ask. The first thing is to start doing some of the techniques that they've been doing since the 90s. I mean, some of these techniques have to be called redundant. I mean, you have to stop draining the peatlands. It's very basic. You have to start using fires as a means for clearing the land. These are kind of like very pragmatic things. There has to be a rule of law. The state has to practice the rule of law and has to kind of like do things much tighter. And I think this is something that to some extent happened following the 2015 fires, because there was a lot of pressure put on the Indonesian state. At that point, they actually did hold a lot of a big number of companies liable because they had fires inside their plantation sites, and from then kind of like it came lower, the kind of like the number of companies who were still practicing this burning thing, but really it's. we have to kind of like rethink some of the things. Yes, you know, like this goal of stop the fire, stop the drainage canal. These are the first steps, but we also have to kind of like think a bit longer. I mean, palm oil plantation in itself, the clearing of a forest and the building, like the kind of like, you know, planting only one type of tree in such large areas of land. This in itself is an ecological crime. The kind of species that depend on these forests, their livelihood is in danger. Maybe not humans, but there are other kinds of species, and you know, we have to understand this. We have to kind of like develop the vocabulary around which these things can be understood as crimes. And I think we're at the beginning of this, but we can. I mean, like, you know, like we just have to.
Yeah, I mean, there's a question kind of within me is like, how far can an industrial practice bend before it breaks? Or like to the, I mean, this is a bit maybe more clear with oil, but like, wouldn't it just be better if they didn't extract oil at all? Or if they didn't, you know, harvest palm oil to such scale and to such an extent? So this is why I kind of wanted to start the conversation about like, you know, what's our agenda, but also what is maybe feasible or what is reasonable, or let's say, how can we manage, or how can we reconcile this more long-term, more radical aim and agenda that we understand to be absolutely necessary to the future of our global ecosystem and to not just mankind, but to life on this planet? How can we reconcile those aims with these more kind of small-scale actions that say, no, actually, you can still keep taking oil, or you can still, you can keep harvesting palm oil, but just not do that one thing that you're doing, or two things?
I think in the case of Shell, we would, of course, love Shell to stop digging for oil. Actually, our second court case is about that. The Paris Climate Agreement says that if we want to prevent the Earth heating up more than 1.5 degrees, then most of the oil needs to stay in the ground. So that would mean for a company like Shell that they would not only have to stop producing less, they can also not look for new gas or oil reserves. But the climate agreement has only been signed by countries, not by companies. So we really think that the climate agreement should also be for companies, and that our government should be able to say to companies like Shell, and all the countries should be able to say to their own oil and gas companies, okay, you can keep your oil that you have now, but you will have to make sure it becomes less and less and less in the future. But you're not allowed to look for more oil and gas anymore. But that's very difficult. But that's well, we would like to go there, so that the Paris Climate Agreement becomes like a law for the entire world.
On that also, I think, you know, like the kind of, we have a lot of work to do, and I think like being in the court of law this is just one of the forums that we should be working in. And there are a lot of questions. I mean, what are, like, one of them is the rights, question of rights. Rights are not laws, they're quite different. I mean, what are the rights of nature? What are the rights of an orangutan? What are the rights? I mean, it's you know, like, and there are different types of forums that you can bring these, and each one of these forums can bring something else. I mean, Tribunals, yes. Exhibitions like Bach, yes. What we're sitting here, yes. I mean, each one of these forums, I think, have to raise questions, and we should kind of like think together. And there are steps. And the legal forum is just one of these forums that we should go for. We should go really hard on, but it has its own limitations that the others might not have, and they have other limitations. You know, like it's.
Yeah, but I can't help. I mean, I kind of want to maybe focus on this or speak about this for a little bit longer, because companies that are ruled by capitalist logics don't want to change what they're doing. You have to kind of speak in their own terms, maybe. But I remember actually when I was kind of formulating this with the team, I had a conversation with Maria, and you know, we were speaking about how it's almost strange to be coming from the tradition of critical theory that tends to try and deconstruct or critique law, to now maybe invest some legitimate hope in that forum. You know, we could say this is what happens when the tide is turned. This is what happens when, you know, the economy has superseded the power of politics, et cetera. But yeah, I mean, I think also, I mean, I totally understand what you're, and I think your point is a super important one, and I think it's also it's a very essential point to the practice of forensic architecture, and in kind of revealing what it takes to create a movement, or what it takes to affect change. But I do, you know, you mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, maybe not the beginning, in the middle, that, you know, this case that you were doing was trying to work at a level of universal jurisdiction. And law works in a certain way, and you could say that social movements do it as well, but the idea or the term of precedence has a particular power to it, especially when, you know, or arguably so when working on the level of universal jurisdiction. And so I guess kind of within this, you know, within this framework of kind of reconciling, you know, long-term goals with short-term, like, let's say, strategies with tactics, even, we could say. I wonder if you know, to what extent you see these activities that you're doing as being capable of setting something like precedent, and maybe, because I'm thinking of this case that you're doing to try and get Shell to stop drilling, like, more widely. I mean, I'm kind of speculating here, but, you know, if Shell is a company that is based in the Netherlands, that its company is founded here and registered here, why can it not abide according to the laws that the country that it is within? And so I wonder, you know, I think in each of these cases, if there was ecocide to be, you know, in one form or another, as you said, if the language of ecocide could start to enter into the sphere of universal jurisdiction, or if it could enter into the sphere of even, you know, national politics, I wonder what sorts of effects you might see that as having, or hope that to have. Or similarly, do you think that the power of precedent in this situation might actually not be that automatic as it might suggest?
Yeah, there are a lot of questions there, I think. Yeah. Well, I mean, somebody just needs to start a lawsuit to have a precedent. So I think that not this Shell Nigeria case, but the other case, we're the first one to really sue an oil company, not for money, because the other case is not about money, but it's about changing the policy of a company. Nobody ever did that before. But if we would win this case, it would not only mean that other countries would also start similar cases, but it would also mean for oil companies to start thinking like, okay, I'm in danger because people could sue me now and I could also lose. So precedence is also that companies would start thinking themselves, and same goes for ecocide. If ecocide becomes the same thing as genocide, then companies would really start to change their policies by themselves. I think sometimes we don't even need lawsuits anymore, because if we change the law, then they would change their own policy. So I think it would be very wise to think of ways of changing the law. At Friends of the Earth Netherlands, and I think with a lot of companies, we work on a UN binding treaty. And a UN binding treaty is actually like a big set of laws that multinationals should abide by. So that even if you're, because that's why these things happen, like Shell in the Netherlands, they have laws, but once they start working in Nigeria, there are different laws, there's a corrupt government, they can do everything with money, even more, if you don't have any money, you won't get anywhere. But if you would have like laws like in a UN binding treaty that would be, you could apply that for the entire world, I think that would be a lot easier. So that you don't have to go to court in every country, because it takes a lot of time.
On that also, I want to kind of like give a slightly kind of like a positive and less dark image of law. We have a forest in Ecuador who has a right, and we have a water body in New Zealand who has a right, and we have a Sandra in Argentina who has a right. And it's like really interesting in this video, the court video, if you hear, at some point the judge goes, okay, now that an orangutan is a subject of law, what is next? Is it a cat? Is it a dog? Is it like, we just open the Pandora's box? No, like, I mean, there are precedents. It's not that we're starting from a point zero. We just have to use our precedents more fiercely, I think.
Yeah, but so I don't know how many other orangutans there might be in Argentina, but do you think now that like, is it just Sandra, or is it maybe like the other ones that are there too?
It's you know, like, I mean, so our our partner Mauricio Corbalan, he's really behind this campaign. So the moment that this habeas corpus was launched, he started kind of like televising the courts, kind of like interviewing everyone, kind of like, and he's pushing through that. Okay, so can we extend this to other kinds of animals who are also living in the zoo? Or and it's very focused. I mean, you know, like, you have to be focused in order to make it work. But then we can borrow Sandra in Indonesia, maybe.
Yeah, get her own passport, which I'm sure actually most animals have. Anyways, at this point, I wanna turn to the audience, if I can see, to take any questions that might be there. I see one in the middle. And then a second there.
Yes, thank you for your presentations. I was a little bit surprised to have the whole evening on the ecocide and to hear so little about non-human species. And also the focus on the orangutan as with the question whether it's a human or nature. I wonder why that question is so relevant and why we keep searching in these categories. Wouldn't you say that if you talk about bringing about change, that the bringing about change is not so much in proving that an orangutan has some form of rationality, with, I have to say, a rather random liquid test? I mean, you could try that with a tree. No, I'm just trying to say, wouldn't bringing about change be on a way more fundamental level and looking on seeing a way out of these dualities, nature, human, object, subject, fact, fiction, these dualities in which also law is categorized, and fighting that image? And how do you include in your projects this interrelationality between all these species, what actually the ecosystem is about? How do you bring about an understanding and sensitivity of the ecosystem? Because I really think you need that before you can speak of a language of ecosystem.
Thank you for your question. I completely get that. We were quite concerned in the beginning when we started with the orangutan, because it's kind of like a trap that that the larger animals, the whale, the orangutan, they get kind of like all the rights basically, and the rest are left alone. But honestly, we had to do this because you have to start from somewhere, right? Like there is a hard line that is archaic, but there is a hard line, and it's been there for a while, and we really want to get rid of this hard line that separates the object subject, the nature, urban. We really do. But how do you do this? Yes, we have to think outside of this line. But that's one way to deal with it. The other way is to start just you know, like with the line, to like make it a bit thicker and a bit thicker and a bit thicker, until it's just kind of like dissolves, right? And we had the case of Sandra in Buenos Aires, and for us that was already, I mean, it was a precedent on which we could build. Yes, of course, there's like, I mean, like we should, and like we worked with, we were working with an anthropologist based in Durham University who was kind of like looking at the sound culture of orangutans, the way they speak between themselves, between other types of species in the forest, the way they use the forest, so there are particular parts of the forest that the sound can travel much further than other parts, and it's precisely about kind of like, you know, showing that entanglement. I mean, like, you know, like talking about it in a way that we would understand our own life. How do you describe this entanglement? And it's baby steps, and it's not, yeah. Yes. But then again, I mean, like, I wouldn't say that they're random. I mean, like, these are the ways. I mean, the peanut test, the liquid test, they're the ways our science works. These are the tests based on which you identify, like, you know, as and you have to use that. Why would you? Like, yes, they have their limitation, of course. I mean, it just looks funny. It's just like, do we have to like come to the peanuts to understand that the orangutan is a sentient being? I mean, isn't that sad? But if that's where we have to start, let's start there. You know, it's sad, but you put bricks, like, you know, you have to start somewhere.
And I think this question that, you know, you said that the lawyer in the Sandra case was asking is maybe reflective of this, but also exactly the question that needs to be asked. If we start here, where does it end? And maybe it shouldn't end, but I think, you know, that at least is a situation where somebody who has influence over law, whether we think law is important or not, it still has some sort of power to it. Where I think the right types of questions that lead in that direction are being asked.
We just need this, like, we have these little cracks. We just have to work on them.
Yeah, amplify them.
Yeah.
There was another question there.
Yeah, I have a question for you as well. I mean, it's maybe a little bit critical. It's the question, are you more in advocacy or in research? And how are you, let's say, treating the bias of advocative observation? And how does it influence on your research practices? I mean, do you see the difference here, or do you treat this bias at your work?
I have a question for you. How do you separate advocacy from research?
I mean, because you reference a lot science, it's kind of a scientific objectivity, but at the same time you're using this scientific objectivity to argue, of course, political and legal issues, and at the same time you claim being independent researcher, but at the same you advocate something very specific. So do you have any methodology to separate this, or you use research to advocate?
I mean, we're quite. I think we're. It's a research agency who investigates crimes that are committed by states or corporations when the crime bears upon the built environment. And of course, like when you are investigating a crime that you think might be, you have a question whether it's being committed by this body, you have intentions. I mean, like we would never say that we're. I mean, it's. I mean, objectivity is. You know.
It's overrated.
Yeah, it's overrated.
It's impossible.
It's impossible.
Is there? I see one at the way back, and there's a couple more here. Sorry, it's not the easiest to say.
Good evening, thank you both for your presentations. I was wondering about a question that you both mentioned about creating a precedent. And just to give an example about what you mentioned about the outcome of the Paris Agreement about the drilling, how is it going to be in practical terms possible when a country like the US pulled out from the Paris Agreement? I mean, I feel like there is going to be a huge disconnect between what we would really like to do and what in practice is going to be possible. How do you want to reconcile these two? Because if something is going to create obligations towards a country which is pulling out and which is one of the main actors in this field, I feel like it's going to be quite difficult to create.
Yeah, I can't. Well, first of all, I think we were all very happy about the Paris Climate Agreement, but actually the Paris Climate Agreement is quite shitty. I mean, you have to compromise with 195 countries, so that was really difficult. And I think the world was really happy, but if we now see how hard it is to get to stay below the 1.5 degrees, then the Paris Climate Agreement isn't hard enough, but it's the only thing we have at the moment. That America pulled out, I mean, that's horrible, also because they're a big industry. I think in the NGO, green NGO world, we all hope that in how long is Trump going to stay? 2.5 more years? I don't know.
Hopefully not.
That they'll get a new president and that they will get back in because we really need them as well. But I think we're just now, for the moment, we're using the Paris Climate Agreement because that's the only thing we have. But if I speak for all the NGOs, we would really like to have a tougher agreement than the one we have now.
There was a question here, then over there.
Thanks. Wow, we can hold the microphones. Samaneh and Hilde, thank you for your respective works, because like slow violence, as we mentioned, really meets its nemesis in research, in activism, and in the courts. But I am concerned about speed here, because you mentioned how the Nigeria case takes 10 years, and we know that we don't have another 10 years to have drastic changes. we don't have 10 years for Shell to appeal all the petty points of court cases. So how does rule of law is supposed to work in your like theories of change, if you like, in times of catastrophic change, or let's be more optimistic, in radical transformation times? Our courts are really on our side in these cases, since time isn't on our side, if you like. And so basically, is slow justice still justice? And are these institutions our friends? Thanks.
Well, I think you can, yeah, this one, I mean, this case is really exceptional, that it takes 10 years. I don't know if you heard about the Urgenda case. It's a case against the Dutch government, and it actually has been won. It has been won, but the Dutch government appealed again. But I really think that you can make a revolution by law, because a judge really needs to listen to you, and he really needs to judge as well. He has to say what's right and what's wrong. Sometimes for us, it's easier to go to court than to lobby at the government, and also because the governments change. Like every 4 years, then there's this new coalition, and like 4 years ago, or no, I think 8 years ago, we might have had a better coalition, but this coalition that we have now, it's not green at all, and it's not doing anything for the climate. So I think sometimes going to court actually is faster than talking to a government and going there again, and then after 4 years you have to go there again, and then there are different people. So the Nigeria case is not a good example, but I think if you look at the Urgenda case, I think we could really change the world through lawsuits. But yeah, so it takes time.
There was a question over here.
Thank you for your presentations. We've been listening to a presentation about a lawsuit and one about forensic architecture, and I was wondering about the crossover. Is forensic architecture helping Milieudefensie as a technique in the lawsuit, or as a means of gathering evidence? And also, is forensic architecture involved in more lawsuits around the world about the change of the environment?
There are, so the way the research agency works, I mean, there are, to kind of like give a bigger picture, we have people who are doing PhDs on rights of environment, who have been doing it, who are doing postdocs on it. So they're kind of like larger research projects, longer with longer period of time that they're doing, that are running within the center, within FA. We have been presenting in a court in Guatemala where we could prove that there is an entanglement between ecocide and genocide in Guatemala, where destruction of forests was used as a means for removing people from particular parts of the land, and kind of like displacing them, and then they were kind of like then moved into these particular types of settlements that were then built, and so on and so forth. But so we could prove this entanglement. There are kind of like there is a project that we're working on herbicide in Gaza. There is a project in Colombia that Hannah Martin has been running. There are kind of like projects. The court one that we had was in Guatemala that already went to court and was successful. But the rest are kind of like they're building up.
Yeah, we met today for the first time. And I think her research is very interesting, because we also work on palm oil in Indonesia. I think it would be, we didn't do any court cases there yet, but I think in the future it would be very handy to use their techniques as well. In the Nigeria case, it's we don't use it in that kind of way because a satellite photo can't, and that's probably also one of the difficulties in the case. I mean, you can see on a satellite photo that there's a leak, but you can't zoom in that much that you can see who caused the leak. And in our case, it's very important to know whether it was rebels, it was bad maintenance, it was corrosion. So we can't use these techniques in this case, but I think in the future we could very well use techniques with like the same you do. Yeah, thanks.
We should do collaboration.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? I see no hands. Okay. I guess then we can maybe start to bring this to a close. I realize I've rambled for quite a long time because I really care about this issue, and I'm really invested in it. But I found it was interesting how there was kind of the specter of kind of optimism and pessimism kind of hovering over this talk. And yeah, I think this question that was asked of, like, you know, are these is the state, are the courts our friends? It's a really good it's a really good question. But I think, you know, what it actually takes to build a movement and to create a revolution is much more all-encompassing than it was, you know, back at the turn of the 20th century or before. And, you know, with proposals on the table in some places like a Green New Deal, et cetera, I think, you know, this work is only becoming increasingly more urgent, more necessary, and also more inspiring and more, and it's something that I think really gives hope, you know, that we're starting to learn the language, and that people are starting to recognize what these words mean within places that matter. So I think it's been incredible to see these presentations and to have this discussion. So I just want to thank you both again, to thank the audience, to thank Wietske, to thank Maria, to thank the rest of the Bach team, and to invite you all to giving the presenters a round of applause and then to join us outside for some drinks.